We spend a lot of time on this show covering the various prongs of the U.S. machine of endless war. Bombings and invasions and coups and financing multiple foreign militaries and wars and propping up friendly dictators and the like. But one of the most significant arms of U.S. war policy is also one of the most ignored. That is the way in which the U.S. government at any given moment is imposing sanctions on all sorts of other countries, typically with the stated objective that is virtually never served by those sanctions, and far more frequently have the opposite effect. Namely, these sanctions suffocate the country and cause immense suffering for ordinary people who live there, while strengthening the regimes that the U.S. is ostensibly attempting to overthrow. You can look wherever sanctions are found, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Syria, in Iran, in Russia, and the same pattern repeats itself. Given what a central weapon the sanction regime is for U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. just announced a new round of sanctions this week for Russia in the wake of the Navalny death. We think it would be really worthwhile to delve into the reality of this instrument, how it works and does not work, who it weakens and who it does not weaken, and the very real cost for Americans. To help us with that examination, we will speak to a professor at St. Joseph's University whose research focuses on state formation and transitions to capitalism within the states of the former Soviet Union. He is David Siegel, and he had an article in April of 2022 at the start of the war in Ukraine in the journal World Affairs entitled "The Failure of U.S. Sanctions on Russia," that argued that the nature of the oligarchical class in Russia made it very unlikely that sanctions would change Russian behavior. I think 2 years later, that article has been vindicated, and we will talk to him about what it was that he saw, both about sanctions in Russia and sanctions more broadly. So speaking of the U.S. security state, there are lots of things that get attention. Obviously, we spend a lot of time on the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the various Middle East wars, bombing Iraq and Syria and Yemen, as well as things involving China. These things are more overt, but there's a regime of sanctions that the United States often uses, and I think a lot of people tend not to pay too much attention to it because it seems like this kind of benign or benevolent step short of war that people are kind of happy about. Well, if the United States is only sanctioning, then perhaps it means that it's a substitute for war, so we shouldn't care too much about sanctions. They don't seem that destructive. They don't seem that provocative. And in reality, I think it's really worth delving into exactly what the sanctions regime is, because at any time the United States is imposing sanctions regimes on multiple other countries that basically make it illegal or almost impossible to trade with those countries, to sell them any goods, to buy goods from them. And typically the idea is that the point of it, even though sanctions are under international law an act of war, the claim of the United States government is we're doing this so that we don't have to go to war with these countries, and instead we're weakening their governments to try and ensure that by causing suffering on the part of the people who live in those countries, they will rise up and change the government. The problem is that never works. Almost always the exact opposite happens, which is that the suffering of the people in those countries ends up weakening them, making them more dependent on that government and strengthening the government that we say we're trying to weaken through the sanctions regime. And if I know that, and if studies prove that, obviously people in Washington know that as well, which raises the question of why the sanction regime continues to be a tool that almost attracts no opposition every time it's proposed. And it's proposed and used all the time. Just yesterday, or today rather, there's a new round of sanctions, this from The Guardian. Biden announces hundreds of new sanctions targeting Russia. I didn't even know it was possible to find new things to sanction in Russia. I assumed everything in Russia had already been sanctioned. Quote, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine reaches its second anniversary, the U.S. will impose new restrictions on Russian exports. Quote, Joe Biden on Friday announced that Washington would issue more than 500 new sanctions targeting Russia as the U.S. seeks to increase pressure on Moscow. Quote, they will ensure Putin pays an even steeper price for his aggression abroad and repression at home, Biden said of the new sanctions. So after everything that we've been told Putin has done, after he annexed Crimea, after he invaded Ukraine, after he committed all these war crimes, after he killed journalists, after he killed dissidents, there were all these sanctions left to weaken him further that we hadn't used until today. Does that make a lot of sense to you? The Guardian goes on, quote, still, Russia's economy has performed above expectations, with the International Monetary Fund in January forecasting 2.6% GDP growth for 2024, a 1.5 point upgrade from an October estimate after solid 3% growth in 2023. An IMF spokesman, Julie Kozak, said on Thursday it was, quote, clear that Russia is now in a war economy, with military expenditures boosting weapons production, government social transfers propping up consumption, and inflation that is rising despite declines elsewhere. So remember, we've been told, and I remember reports that we could show you from the first and second and third months of the war, where all of the advocates of this U.S. involvement in Ukraine were telling us that Russia was on the verge of collapse, that the ruble was going to completely be hollowed out, that they were going to run out of artillery and bullets because they just were going to be squeezed by the sanction regime that we imposed on them. And here we are 2 years later, as well as being told that we were weakening Russia by sending hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainian men to their deaths. We were weakening Russia. And here you find the Russian economy growing, its military more powerful than ever. They're in a war economy, just like the United States was during World War II. And all of the military benefits and economic benefits that the United States often gets when it goes into a war footing are now happening in Russia, despite all of these sanctions that we continue to impose on them. So aside from whatever moral or ethical issues there are with sanctions, there's also just the fact that they do not work, as evidenced by what's taking place in Russia. Now, here is an MSNBC report from this week where Michael McFaul, the former Obama administration ambassador to this is a report from MSNBC Morning Joe show that actually talks about this sanctions. We're going to get to that Michael McFaul video in just a second, but here's just a report explaining what the Biden administration is doing.
Steve Ratner. So, yeah, how is it doing? Because you would think at this point that it would be breaking down a bit,
but it's
Russian
not.
economy. But are you finding otherwise, Steve?
Yeah, no, it's not, Mika. You know, sanctions are an important part of waging war against any adversary or any of our opponents, but we have to be realistic about what they've accomplished. And in the case of Russia, unfortunately, they haven't accomplished that much. So let's take a look.
So here is MSNBC. Obviously, they are fanatically anti-Russian, and as much as it hurts them, even they can't deny the data, and they're admitting that our sanctions have done nothing in the way of fulfilling any of the objectives that we claimed were going to be fulfilled by the sanction regime. Just listen to them acknowledge this by doing nothing other than looking at the irrefutable data.
Look at the Russian economy since the war started. And if you look at GDP, real GDP, over the last 2 years, you can see the Russian economy actually grew by 1.8%. And that's more than most of the countries in Europe. As Joe has been pointing out, far less than the U.S., still the shining city on the hill.
Have to make sure to do a campaign ad for Joe Biden. He's presiding over the shining city on the hill. So, of course, Russia is nowhere near as prosperous and happy as the United States, but still, even MSNBC is required to acknowledge that even with all these sanctions, it has more economic growth than much of the industrialized democratic world, including our Western European allies, while the Ukraine economy, as you see at the end there, has basically gone into free fall, into collapse.
Actually, a tiny bit less than Italy, but essentially above all the rest of these countries. And in contrast, Ukraine down 24% in the size of its economy. And that's been reflected.
Kind of a pretty big number to rush over that way. Ukraine has lost a quarter of its economy, 25% drop, collapse in 1 year in its economy, while the Russian economy continues to grow. That not only illustrates the inefficacy of the sanctions regime, but also the way in which the United States is becoming utterly subverted and undermined in terms of our power to influence the world. Our ally in this war, meaning the U.S. government's ally, I should say, is getting decimated, can't keep up with artillery production, and has a destruction of a quarter of their economy in 1 year, while the Russian economy, who we've supposedly isolated from the world, is growing faster than Japan, France, Germany, and the UK's.
In the stock market. When the war started, I think we all thought, including myself, that this would be tough for the Russian economy. Stock market dropped 25% in the first week, ended up down 40% by the end of 2022, but now it's up 47% from where it was before all this started. So
the Russian stock market is up almost 50% since the war began in 2022. I remember people like Steve Ratner, exactly as I was saying they were all saying, oh, look, the Russian economy is in free for all. The ruble is going to collapse. And here we are, and the Russian economy is growing, and their stock market, if you had invested in the Russian stock market, $10,000, say, on February 24th, 2022, when the invasion happened, that $10,000 would now be worth $15,000 because there's been a 50% increase in the value of the Russian stock market.
The Russian economy is still doing well.
Steve, part of the reason for that is, of course, oil, the exporting of oil. I was staggered to read in your information here that the oil exports are kind of back to where they were in 2021 before this war started, despite all these sanctions, because other countries have stepped in to help Russia here.
Well, you did my chart for me, Willie, but yes,
Sorry,
that is what, no, that's okay. That is what.
I just want you to think for a second, and this is why this segment is so excellent, because I want you to remember all the things we were being told were happening as part of this war, that the entire world was united behind the United States, that Joe Biden had rallied the entire world, that Russia was completely isolated on the international stage. None of that was true. None of it was true. None of it is true. All sorts of countries are trading with Russia. That's why their economy is growing. That's why their oil exports are booming. Everybody who wants to is buying from the Russian oil market, except for the United States and Western Europe, which has harmed its own citizens in all sorts of ways in pursuit of this war, including by having to buy more expensive natural gas and oil. That was what Nord Stream 2 was supposed to be for, to allow Western Europeans to buy cheap natural gas from the Russians. And by cutting themselves off from the Russian market, the Western Europeans and the Americans have completely harmed their own citizens and its economic prosperity. But the rest of the world is happy to continue to trade with Russia because the sanction regime no longer works. The United States no longer has the power that we were told it has at the start of this war to isolate anybody, certainly not a country like Russia.
What's going on? But before, I should also mention additional oil. Defense spending has helped the Russian economy. They have more than doubled their defense spending, and that juices the economy. But to Willie's point, you can see Russian oil state revenues and where they were before the war. We had this price spike. This is price, not selling more oil, but just price. When the war started, and then oil prices have remained relatively strong. So Russian oil revenue is actually still above where it was before the war started. And as Willie said, the sanctions have not had any impact on Russia's oil exports. They're almost exactly the same as what they were before the war started. But you can see a big shift in the mix. You can see that Europe and the U.S. have virtually eliminated Russian oil imports, but that's been picked up by three countries, Turkey to a smaller extent, India big, and China big. India 1,800% more oil from Russia than before. So these sanctions have not had any effect on Russia's oil exports and therefore on its revenues.
So, Steve, why India on that chart? Is it out of necessity, or why are they stepping in to help Ukraine as it, effectively kills civilians waging a war?
It's basically necessity. They obviously don't care that much about killing civilians in Ukraine by the war.
Oh, yeah, that's what it is. Only the United States cares. Only Western Europe cares. We're the benevolent ones. The rest of the world doesn't care. Maybe the rest of the world just doesn't think that the situation between Russia and Ukraine is as clear-cut in terms of the morality play that we're told. Here in Brazil, for example, the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, who is a U.S. ally, he just met this week with Secretary of State Blinken in Brasilia, where the United States considers Brazil a very important country that has friendly relations with the United States, said during the campaign and has said since that he believes that at least half of the blame for this war belongs with the United States and Zelensky. The United States that encouraged Zelensky stupidly to believe that he could actually win a war against Russia, and therefore to not negotiate a diplomatic solution that could have averted all of this. So it's the Democratic Party and the Mitch McConnell wing of the Republican Party that is willing to sacrifice the interests of its population over who gets to rule various provinces in eastern Ukraine, but the rest of the world is not. And increasingly, that is what is happening in the United States in terms of our ability to use soft power to run the world. We are increasingly becoming isolated, certainly with the war in Ukraine, and even more so with U.S. support for the war in Israel. Now, I think a lot of people vaguely know that a lot of times when sanctions are imposed on a country, it kills a huge number of people. And when we covered the letter that Osama bin Laden wrote to the American people in 2002 to justify the 9/11 attack, one of the main points he raised, in addition to U.S. troops on Saudi soil and U.S. support for Israel to repress the Palestinians, was exactly that. The sanctions regime imposed on Iraq in the 1990s, a decade worth of sanctions, ended up killing hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis. And that is often what the result is of the sanction regime. Note that the sanction regime, while it killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, did not remove Saddam Hussein from power. He stayed in power through 2003. It took an actual full ground invasion to remove him from power. But the sanction regime did nothing to Iraq other than kill a huge number of its citizens and immiserate the population. And for what? Here's the report of the International Committee of the Red Cross in December of 1999, Iraq, 1989 to 1999, a decade of sanctions. Quote, according to the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF survey published in August 1999, infant mortality in most of Iraq has more than doubled in the 9 years since U.S. sanctions were imposed. That's infant mortality, the number of babies we killed, Iraqi babies. In central and southern Iraq, home to 85% of the population, the death rate for children under 5 rose from 56 per 1,000 live births in the period 1984 to 1989 to 131 per 1,000. According to UNICEF statistics for November 1997, a third of all children under 5 are chronically malnourished. This represents a 72% increase since 1991. So when you're thinking about the effects of the sanctions regime and the idea that it's benevolent, it may not seem like it's that big of a deal if you're in the country imposing it. But if you're in the country on whom it's being imposed, the result is things like a third of all children in the country under the age of 5 become chronically malnourished at a rate of 72% higher than prior to the imposition of the sanctions regime. What do you think the people in that country and in that region start to think about the United States when they watch things like children, enormous numbers, dying of malnourishment and starvation, unable to get basic medications that they need to cure and treat highly treatable diseases that they die from instead, all while the government remains not only in place and entrenched, but even stronger. The UNICEF article goes on, quote, Iraq's 130 hospitals, many of them built by foreign companies in the 1960s to the 1980s, have not received the necessary repairs or maintenance since the Gulf War, but above all since the imposition of sanctions. They often lack, the hospitals do, the most basic tools such as stethoscopes, sterilizers, and writing paper. The negative impact on the treatment received by patients, and hence on their health, is immense. Now here's a notorious video in which the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, who presided over the sanction regime imposed on the Iraqi people, was actually asked on 60 Minutes a question that I think these days you would never hear a corporate media journalist ask of a Democratic Secretary of State. And this is a clip that resonated all throughout the Arab and Muslim world, and people in the West saw it too. I mean, it's an incredibly sociopathic face that Madeleine Albright showed the world, and it didn't have to do with invasions or bombing campaigns or any of the things we typically associate with the U.S. war machine. Instead, it was about sanctions.
She says the U.S. is trying to prevent Saddam Hussein from making and dropping a nuclear bomb or chemical weapons on other countries. And she says he's still lying about his weapons programs.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. It is a moral question, but the moral question is even a larger one. Don't we owe to the American people and to the American military and to the other countries in the region that this man not be a threat.
Let me just ask you this question. It is definitely the case that if you are a policymaker at a top level inside the U.S. government, you have hard choices. It's not like any one of your choices in certain situations will be morally pure. I suppose we have to accept the fact that the most powerful country on the planet, which is what the United States was, especially in the 1990s, that was the decade after the Soviet Union fell. We were told we were going to get this great peace dividend where we wouldn't have to spend money on our military anymore. And of course, the Clinton administration found all sorts of wars to fight, including in the Balkans. That was when Madeleine Albright said to Colin Powell, who was opposed to the intervention in the Balkans, what's the point of having this big, shiny, beautiful military if we don't use it? It was like a toy to her. You know, like, hey, we paid for this, why don't we use it? But even if you want to give them license that, look, there's people they have to kill, there's violence they have to use, you would think someone's conscience would be bothered by that. Like that somebody, when asked, the policy that you imposed killed 500,000 Iraqi children. And let's say that it wasn't 500,000. People have debated that. The UNICEF report says a couple 100,000. Clearly, hundreds of thousands of children died, Iraqi children, died from the U.S. sanctions regime during that decade. To just so unflinchingly look and say, yeah, it was absolutely worth it. It's a tough call, but absolutely worth it. That is sociopathic behavior of the worst kind. And that is why I think sanctions deserve so much more attention than they get. Like I said, I think on some level Americans feel like, well, as long as the U.S. isn't going to war, let them do sanctions, because that at least seems like a step before war. But what is the point of it? It never succeeds in weakening the country or removing the leader. It only succeeds in immiserating the population. Here from The Lancet in March of 2020, at the start of the COVID pandemic, you may recall that the COVID pandemic went from China to Iran, and then the two hardest hit countries in Europe early on were Italy and Spain. But Iran was overwhelmed with COVID cases at the very start of the pandemic, before it even got to the United States. And they were under some of the most repressive sanctions possible. And you may look at the Iranian government and hate the Iranian government, but it's not the Iranian government that pays the price for these sanctions. So here from The Lancet, you see the headline, COVID-19 battle during the toughest sanctions against Iran. Quote, the economic loss caused by the spread of COVID-19 in Iran coincides with the ever highest politically induced sanctions against the country. Quote, although various sanctions have been in place for the past 4 decades, since May 2018, the unilateral sanctions imposed by the USA against Iran have increased dramatically to an almost total economic lockdown, which includes severe penalties for non-U.S. companies conducting business with Iran. The Iranian health sector, although among the most resilient in the region, has been affected as a consequence. All aspects of prevention, diagnosis, and treatment are directly and indirectly hampered, and the country is falling short in combating the crisis. Lack of medical, pharmaceutical, and laboratory equipment, such as protective gowns and necessary medication, has been scaling up the burden of the epidemic and the number of casualties. We should not let history repeat itself. More than 500,000 Iraqi children and nearly 40,000 Venezuelans were killed as a result of UN Security Council and U.S. sanctions in 1994 and 2017 to 2018, respectively. Venezuela is another case where people decided that they hated Hugo Chavez, even though he never attacked any other country, and therefore imposed enormous amounts of suffocating sanctions on Venezuela, both under Hugo Chavez and then again under Nicolas Maduro. And then we point to the fact that there's starvation in Venezuela and disease in Venezuela, which there is, at least in part because of this suffocating sanctions regime that did not weaken Hugo Chavez nor Nicolas Maduro. All it did was immiserate the population. So for what? Here from NPR in April of 2021, quote, the beautiful dreams that are burnt, portraits from Iran under sanctions. Kazem Mojaban, a manager in a private hospital in Yazd, said he is dealing with challenges that didn't exist before the sanctions. Even though the U.S. says its restrictions do not target the health center, according to Mojaban, shortages in medicines and surgical equipment are just some examples of how the sanctions end up affecting Iran's medical centers. Naima Mousavi from the capital of Tehran has been under treatment for 2 years since receiving a kidney transplant. She has confronted new challenges and struggles regarding her treatment, which she says started when the U.S. reimposed sanctions on Iran. Transplant medications are vital and rare. Because of Iran's shortage of drugs, government-funded hospitals and clinics distribute medicines at the start of each month to cover 4 weeks of treatment. She doesn't know whether she will still have next month's medication. Now, why is that justified? It doesn't prevent Iran from doing much of anything that we say we want to prevent them from doing. And if anything, it's the reason why there's so much hatred and hostility towards the United States in that region. Ron Paul, who I think most people know or was a principled non-interventionist, still is a principled opponent of war, also was a person who believes in economic liberty. He's a libertarian. He's the anti-communist. Nobody can suggest that Ron Paul is sympathetic to communism as an ideology, to put that mildly. And yet he was often horrified by the savage and barbaric regime of sanctions that we imposed on Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and Russia and North Korea for reasons that he has explained many times, including in this August 1st, 2012 speech that he gave on the House floor about the evils of sanctions.
When you put on sanctions on a country, it's an act of war, and that's what this is all about. The first thing you do when war breaks out between two countries is you put sanctions on them. You blockade the country. So this is an act of war. What would we do if somebody blockaded and put sanctions on us and prevented the importation of any product in this country? We'd be furious, we'd declare war, we'd go to war. So we are the antagonists. We're over there poking our nose in other people's affair, just looking for the chance to start another war. First it's Syria, then Iran. We have too many wars. We need to stop the wars. We don't have the money to fight these wars any longer.
And as he noted, sanctions is an act of war. It's a way of attacking other countries. We constantly say here in the United States, it's time to stop trying to fix other countries, interfere in their countries, dictate who their leaders are. That's what sanctions are designed to do. And yet we almost never hear opposition to these sanctions, even though they are costly for Americans in so many ways. Donald Trump, as happens so often, had a kind of instinctive opposition to a lot of policies that his administration ended up imposing. One of them was sanctions in Iran. Here from NBC News in September of 2019, reported that Donald Trump and John Bolton sparred over lifting Iran's sanctions. The national security advisor departed abruptly after President Trump suggested he might lift some sanctions as an incentive for Tehran to get to the negotiating table. That was always Trump's instinct in every case, was to avoid war and negotiate. Quote, as leading national security advisor, John Bolton was a leading advocate of the Trump administration's so-called, quote, maximum pressure campaign designed to squeeze Iran's economy until its leadership was forced to curtail its aggression in the region and concede to U.S. demands to dismantle its nuclear program, none of which has happened. Trump withdrew from the U.S. from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal last year. Iran has since decided not to comply with the agreement. Trump recently has said he would meet with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani perhaps later this month on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session in New York without preconditions. But the person close to Bolton said the president went further during a 2 p.m. meeting on Monday in suggesting he would lift U.S. sanctions. The possibility of Iran's sanctions relief was in part what prompted Bolton to submit a resignation letter to the president the following morning, this person said. Obviously, these leaks are coming from John Bolton to make himself look good. I resigned in protest on principle, in anger that Donald Trump wanted to lift sanctions in Iran, but Trump naturally wants to forge peace deals. And his idea is, we're going to nullify the 2015 deal that Obama negotiated with Iran because it's not tough enough. We want a tougher agreement with Iran. But to get that, we need to negotiate with them and not try and destroy their population. Here from NPR, April of 2023, life in Syria under U.S. sanctions. Earthquakes in Syria expose the devastating needs of people in a war-torn country and raise the questions about the impact of U.S. sanctions. The reason we were told that we had to spend $1 billion a year under President Obama to allow the CIA to try and fight a dirty war alongside Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who are our allies in Syria, to remove Bashar al-Assad is because we cared so deeply about the Syrian people. We just want the best for the Syrian people. We want to protect the Syrian people. And yet the sanctions that we ended up imposing that obviously have no effect on removing Bashar al-Assad did the following, quote, hospitals are lacking MRI machines, CAT scans, heart monitors, and even anesthesia and cancer medications. Oil and banking sanctions were toughened over the past decade to punish President Bashar al-Assad's government as it attacked rebels, bombed civilians, and jailed tens of thousands. The U.S. says its sanctions target Assad's regime and not humanitarian assistance. But doctors in Syria say they have trouble importing basic supplies because foreign banks fear financial penalties. The head of Syria's civil defense said his teams didn't have enough equipment to save lives after the earthquakes. Major General Safwan Balul said they were in need of basic tools like jackhammers and hydraulic lifts. So it's the same thing repeated over and over. And obviously the same thing has happened in Cuba. The same thing has happened in Venezuela. Here, just to give you a report of the effects of sanctions on Venezuela. Obviously, it has had no effect on weakening that country's government. Here from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, it's written by Mark Weisbrot, who I know and who is an expert in Latin American financial and military policy, as well as Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia professor and economist, who is a regular on our show. And they published this report in April of 2019 entitled Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the Case of Venezuela. And they detailed as well the same kinds of destruction on the healthcare system in Venezuela that make it impossible for ordinary Venezuelans to get access to healthcare. Obviously, when someone like Hugo Chavez has a medical problem, as he did when he had cancer, he was able to travel and get some of the best medical care, including in Cuba. These don't affect the leaders of the country, only the ordinary people. And then beyond all those same harms to medical care and the like in the hospital system that we detailed in Syria and Iran, this also happened as a result of the sanctions on Venezuela. Quote, there was a 31% increase in general mortality from 2017 to 2018. I just want you to think about what that means. There was a 1/3 increase in the number of people who died in Venezuela as a result of sanctions from 2017 to 2018. This would imply an increase of more than 40,000 deaths. More than 300,000 people were estimated to be at risk because of lack of access to medicines or treatments. For what? How do we justify just killing 40,000 Venezuelans in 1 year? What is that accomplishing? Quote, this includes an estimated 80,000 people with HIV who have not had antiretroviral treatment since 2017, 16,000 people with cancer, and 4 million people with diabetes and hypertension, many of whom cannot obtain insulin or cardiovascular medicine. So you have treatable diseases like HIV, and yet people, because of the sanctions in Venezuela, cannot access medications to save their lives. Quote, food imports have dropped sharply along with the overall imports. In 2018, they were estimated at just 2.46 billion as compared with 11.2 billion in 2013. The United Nations finds that the groups most vulnerable to the accelerating crisis includes children and adolescents, including many who can no longer attend school, people who are in poverty or extreme poverty, pregnant and nursing women, older persons, indigenous people, women and adolescent girls at risk, people with disabilities. The sanctions also violate U.S. law. Each executive order since March 2015 declares the United States is suffering from a, quote, national emergency because of the situation in Venezuela. This is required by U.S. law in order to impose such sanctions. The national emergency is invoked under the 1976 National Emergencies Act. Here is Mike Pompeo. He obviously featured a lot in our first segment on Julian Assange, and I regard him as Donald Trump's worst mistake. He put him in charge of the CIA and then also made him Secretary of State, even though Mike Pompeo is a classic neocon. Everything Donald Trump claimed he opposed, that was by far Trump's worst vulnerability, is putting people in power who flattered him, regardless of what their ideology or their politics were, or what they intended to do, or whether they had any interest in aligning with the political platform on which he ran. We'll see whether or not, if he wins again, he makes that same mistake. But Mike Pompeo was Exhibit A in that character flaw of Donald Trump that was one of the worst flaws of the Trump presidency. Here's Mike Pompeo pontificating on the sanctions regime.
Continue to take place. Second question was, what Matt, remind me what the second one was. The first one was about, were we satisfied with oil? We're trying to get the oil for the Venezuelan people.
Not for
the Venezuelan people. We are attempting to restore basic rule of law, transparency, democracy, and the wealth that sits in the property basin of Venezuela is for the Venezuelan people.
And then the pace of
the first question is the pace of change.
We love the Venezuelan people. We love them so much, just like we love the Syrian people, that we impose on them sanctions that completely devastate their lives, kill them in large numbers, prevent them from getting medications, prevent them from getting basic sustenance, including food. That's how much we love the Venezuelan people. That's how much we love the Syrian people. And even if you don't care about the moral or ethical component of sanctions, they have incredible geopolitical blowback. And they just simply don't work, to the point where even this most comprehensive sanctions regime that has been imposed on Russia has coincided with the kind of economic growth that we began the segment by documenting, and the ability of Russians to simply form their own separate economy outside of the United States' control, where their oil revenues are increased, where their economic prosperity is increased, where their military strength is increased as well. That is the reality of the sanctions regime. And so when you hear a government or a government official saying, oh, we're going to impose sanctions, and you think to yourself, okay, well, that's pretty harmless. It's better than war. Oftentimes, it is an act of war. It can be as devastating as war. It can kill as many people as war. And it can generate the kind of blowback on the United States every bit as much as bombing or coups or all the other arms and weapons that we use for endless war and domination of these various regions can do as well. Now, to help us understand the sanctions regime generally, but also as it applies to Russia, we have a specialist in this topic. His name is David Siegel. He's a professor at St. Joseph's University. His background is in comparative politics, and his research has focused on state formation and transitions to capitalism within the states of the former Soviet Union, which obviously includes Ukraine. He had an April 2022 article in the journal World Affairs entitled, quote, "The Failure of U.S. Sanctions on Russia," that obviously ended up being quite prescient, since his argument was that sanctions regime on Russia is unlikely to change Russian behavior. I think it's an understatement, if anything, to say that that view has been vindicated. Professor Siegel, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.
Sure. So we just went through this kind of, several decade-old body of research about how sanctions often fail to achieve their stated outcome, and at the same time impose all kinds of harms on the countries that we're targeting without any sort of benefit geostrategically to the United States. If I know about all this and you're doing work and you're able to presciently warn that Russian sanctions on Russia would be unlikely to change their behavior, clearly a lot of people in Washington know that as well. So what is the rationale for this ongoing imposition of sanctions on so many countries, including this new round today or this week on Russia?
It's hard to say, to be honest. I mean, a lot of it, some people would say, is purely symbolic, because most people know that the sanctions don't really work and are not going to work. I think there's an important distinction to be made. You're making it implicitly and others make it implicitly, but there's a distinction between the political effects of sanctions and the economic effects of sanctions. When we say that they don't work, what we mean, and it's not just me, there's a huge academic literature on this, and there's a consensus that politically speaking, they don't work. They don't cause the target state to change its behavior. Economically, they tend to be devastating, but the economic devastation is not supposed to be the goal. The economic pressure is supposed to produce a political outcome, and that political outcome seems never to materialize in all the cases that you just mentioned from Cuba. I mean, there have been sanctions on Cuba since the 1950s. Cuba, Iraq, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, and the list goes on. I had actually argued that the sanctions on Russia, not only were they not working politically, but they were counterproductive and were causing Russia to become more antagonistic. This I wrote actually before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think it's important to note that the U.S. sanctions on Russia did not begin 2 years ago. That's the common framing now in the media. The sanctions on Russia started in 2014. under Barack Obama, and they were continued under Donald Trump, and they were now obviously ratcheted up significantly after 2022, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the U.S. sanctions on Russia began after Russia annexed Crimea in March 2014. So we're nearing like the 10-year anniversary. At the time, this was seen as a radical kind of U.S. move, and it was pretty clear after a few years that they were not changing Russian behavior. The stated objective at that time was to get Russia to withdraw from Crimea and give up its territorial ambitions there. Obviously, Russia did not do that. In 2018, former Ambassador Daniel Fried, who was an architect of these sanctions under the Obama administration, was taking questions at a Senate hearing and defended the sanctions as working based on the logic that even though Russia was not withdrawing from Crimea, it was preventing Russia from taking more aggressive measures that it otherwise would take if sanctions were not in place. And he specifically said that if we had not imposed sanctions on Russia, they would have invaded Ukraine and conquered all of Ukrainian territory. That was in 2018. What's happened? Sanctions were continued under the Trump administration. It clearly did not prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, in 2022. Now the United States has ratcheted up those sanctions. There's enormous sanctions on Russia at this point. And as you've said, it seems to be having, not only is it having no political effect, but I think actually what's really interesting and novel is that they're also having no economic impact. That's different from other cases of sanctions. Russia has been able to very skillfully navigate through these sanctions, building new trade alliances with China and India, Iran, basically the BRICS countries. It's getting off the dollar, it's separating itself from the U.S. financial system, and it's still able to survive. Its oil revenue remains the same. Its economy, as you noted, the IMF actually predicts that Russia's economy is going to grow by 2.6% in 2024. It's going to be, that would make it the leading country in all of Europe. And when the sanctions were first imposed in 2022, I mean, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we were told that the Russian economy was going to collapse. A lot of those same people are now saying, oh yeah, Russia's economy is growing, but the only reason it's growing is because it's spending so much on the military. And the rationale of the sanctions was precisely so that Russia was not going to be able to spend money on the military. It's like the logic of the experts is constantly being rewritten. And it's pretty clear, actually, what all of this means is that the United States is losing its economic influence and is not able to shape the events at a global level as it has been able to do since the end of the Cold War. The United States really started relying heavily on sanctions after the collapse of the Soviet Union because it was a very easy way to go around the world and sort of exert its strength. But here it's pretty clear it's like not having very much influence at all.
So I do want to ask you about and explore that question of whether this kind of multipolarity is really here, whether the BRICS alliance is actually providing now a formidable alternative to a lot of these countries who I think are driven by a lot of resentment over the idea that the United States can just dictate to the world who can trade with them and who can't whenever the United States feels displeased with some of their actions. There's a lot of kind of resentment driving the emergence of this alternative coalition. But just to make, I guess, the best case for the sanctions regime that I can in order to hear your argument against it, I think the argument is that even if it doesn't dislodge the government from power, that what it ends up doing is it ends up significantly impeding the lives of the people who wield the most amount of power in those countries, the wealthiest people, the elites, the oligarchs. Just this week, for example, in Brazil, as kind of an illustrative example, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was visiting Brazil, and he originally went to Rio de Janeiro for a G20 meeting where he happened to be in the same room with Secretary of State Blinken, where Blinken came. They didn't talk, but they were one of a very few number of officials in the same room with the mayor of Rio de Janeiro. And when the Russian foreign minister was scheduled to then travel to Brasilia to meet with President Lula da Silva, he couldn't get gasoline for his plane, for the Russian plane, because the providers of aircraft fuel in Brazil are all tied to the U.S. economy, and we're concerned about the ramifications that they've sold fuel to the Russians. And so Lula dispatched a government plane, a military plane, to take Lavrov to Brasilia, but it's kind of an example of how a lot of the people in Russia, the political officials, the elites, the kind of oligarchs who used to travel to Western Europe and now have had their assets seized or have had their lives impeded, that kind of pressure is supposed to foster behavioral change. That was what you addressed in your article. Why doesn't that work? I mean, it does seem like those impediments are real, at least in some instances.
Right. Logically, it seems like those sanctions should have worked. And by that, I mean, if you go back to 2014, the sanctions that the United States first imposed on Russia are what are called targeted sanctions. They weren't intended to affect the broader Russian economy. They were really designed to target Putin's closest allies and officials in the Russian government to make them bear a personal cost in the ways that you've just described, by freezing assets or making it very difficult to access their wealth that they have stored in European and American banks. And the logic is that these are the people that Putin relies on to stay in power. I think that's actually true. That underlying truth, that's correct. Putin does rely on these very wealthy oligarchs to stay in power. And Putin is supposed to understand the politics of those people having serious grievances. You know, he's supposed to therefore change Russian policy to appease them. But it simply has not had that effect. Putin was able to do various kinds of things by using the leverage of the state and using credits and subsidies and tax policies and incentivizing a lot of oligarchs to bring their money back into Russian banks. One of the paradoxical effects of those sanctions, those targeted sanctions in 2014, is that Russia had a huge inflow of capital. I mean, oligarchs were moving all of their money out of European and American banks and were recapitalizing the Russian banking system. Russia's banks actually, just as another piece of evidence of how badly these sanctions work economically, Russian banks just posted their largest ever profits this year. There's the money of the oligarchs is now basically being protected by the Russian state. And I would say there is more of an alliance between the Russian oligarchs and Vladimir Putin than there was before the sanctions started. So they're having a counterproductive effect. I mean, there was an article in Bloomberg that stated this very bluntly. It was from 2017 or 18 that said, the sanctions are bringing Russia's oligarchs right into Putin's arms. You know, they're consolidating the state elite there. And I think before this, a lot of Russian oligarchs, I mean, they were internationalists. They were bringing their money all over the world. They had incentives not to keep it in Russia, of course, because the rule of law is not very strong there. And now the opposite is true. I think they feel vulnerable to European and American power, and they have an incentive to work more with the Russian state and keep their assets inside Russia.
Yeah, I mean,
most of the evidence.
There were Russian oligarchs like the brothers who founded the encrypted app Telegram, who then also founded kind of the Russian Facebook, who kind of got driven out of Russia for not turning over data, and they had their wealth trifled with. I mean, they're certainly doing perfectly fine, but there have been other instances of billionaires, Russian billionaires, being expelled or having their wealth seized. So there did seem to be an incentive that has now backfired, as you said. But beyond the kind of economic component that you just very adeptly laid out, I think one of the things that has alarmed people or left a lot of people confused, and I may even count myself among them, is the fact that we spend almost $1 trillion a year on our military, and we have done everything possible to try and get artillery into the hands of the Ukrainians, and not just us, but all of our NATO allies, everyone in Europe has done the same, and somehow under this supposedly very intensive sanctions regime that we were told were going to make the Russians run out of bullets. I remember being told that in April and May and June of 2022. The Russians have wildly outproduced all of the NATO, including the United States, when it comes just to the mere production of artillery, a major reason that they're winning the war, along with drones and other things. How have they been able to do that? How have they been able to manufacture and produce so much more military equipment than even the wealthiest and most militarized country in history, which is the United States?
Well, first of all, Russia has a huge arms industry. So, I mean, they're quite good at making weapons. The problem is that the sanctions were supposed to restrict their ability to get important imports into their weapons manufacturing. And they've been able to get around this quite easily, actually. They've just started importing all of those products from China, for one. That's one major. Well, I mean, that's basically why the sanctions are not working. China is basically providing Russia with everything that it needs. Russian imports from China have skyrocketed. Its imports from Europe and the United States have plummeted, and China's made up most of the difference. In addition, Russia has worked a lot with the states of Central Asia and the Caucasus, to a slightly lesser extent, Turkey, and is basically has found buyers in those states to import these goods from both Europe and the United States. So, for example, they'll be imported into Kyrgyzstan, and then Kyrgyz businesses will export them to Russia, completely skirting the restrictions. So in other words, Russia actually is still able to get a lot of inputs from the West. I actually read a report. I don't know if it's just almost anecdotal, but the Russian weapons that have been recovered on the battlefield still are like 98% of the components are still from Western sources. I also read a report recently, British exports to Russia plummeted by 75% after the sanctions, after 2022, but its exports to Uzbekistan went up by the same amount, and Uzbek exports to Russia went up. So it's like all of the product is just moving through other places. And honestly, Russia's been politically and diplomatically adept at navigating through this. China and India are huge counterweights to the United States, and this is why I do think this marks. I mean, I hate to make such bold statements, really, but it potentially marks a huge change in geopolitics, where you do see this transformation happening, where the economic power of China and India and the BRICS as a bloc really does seem to be undermining the power of the United States and Europe. Again, politically, the sanctions probably would have never worked anyway, but economically even, Russia is basically able to get around them. There's almost no discernible impact of the sanctions economically in Russia. As you, like in the case of Venezuela or Iran, as you described earlier, you just don't see that in Russia. There's, stores are full, people have consumer products. I mean, there's some inflation, but the economy does have, like every other economy, there are problems, but it's not, I just spoke to somebody in Moscow today, and there's no discernible change in everyday life in the economy there.
One of the obviously specialties that you have as a scholar and academic is the former Soviet states, which of course include Ukraine. So I just want to ask you, there's of course a protracted debate in the United States about what caused the invasion in 2022 of Russian troops into Ukrainian territory. Obviously, there's been a raging civil war of Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine against the central government in Kiev and the like, but obviously a big escalation when Russian troops in this number invade Ukraine. And obviously, some people say, well, it's because Putin just, I guess, out of the blue became a madman, sort of like a Hitlerian figure. I don't think it's a very serious theory, but a lot of people are convinced of that in the United States. Others say that he suddenly has territorial ambitions to conquer conquer all of Ukraine. And then, of course, others say that it was, at least in part, a defensive act against provocative acts by NATO and the United States to threaten this very sensitive part of the Russian border with NATO expansion and other kinds of interference in Ukraine. What is your view on that overall question of what finally led Putin and the Russians to invade on this level in February 2022?
Yeah, that's a great question. I won't claim that I know the answer. And I think one of the reasons why I think that this happened is because there are so many reasons for Russia to do it. So there's probably some truth to all of the different causes that have been discussed. But I happen to put a lot of weight on Russia's concerns about NATO expansion. And the reason for that is there's a pretty long and well-documented history of Russia speaking out against NATO expansion, explaining very, very clearly, and I'd say even politely in its diplomacy over the course of 20 years, that it finds NATO expansion to be threatening, that it would prefer that there wasn't NATO expansion, that it would like to work closer with NATO. And then, of course, most famously in 2008, when George W. Bush opened the door to Ukraine and Georgia, I mean, Vladimir Putin said at the time, this is a red line. This is a major threat to Russian security. The other possible causes, let's say the heightened Russian ethno-nationalism and its desire to reunite with the ethnic Russian people of Ukraine, or protect ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, or these are there's something to those. I mean, that's real, and certainly the Russian public, I think, has an emotion. There's an emotional appeal to the Russian public for those reasons, and those reasons are probably real. But you don't see a decades-long insistence by the Russian leaders that this is very important, And to me, that helps break out from the news cycle context. And if you just think about it historically, and pay attention to what Russia's been saying, it seems like NATO expansion is a huge part of it. If not, and again, in my view, I know you've had John Mearsheimer on the show many times, and I mostly agree with him on this issue.
So let me ask you a little bit about internal Russian politics, which is something that we think we learn very little about in the West because it's so much propaganda, and it's hard to discern truth from propaganda. In 2008, there was this memo written by the current CIA director, Bill Burns, to Condoleezza Rice and other Bush officials who were kind of proponents of NATO expansion, in which he basically said what you just said, which is that not only for Putin, but essentially everybody in Moscow, including Putin's liberal opponents and critics, the idea of NATO expansion into Ukraine is a red line. It's not just for Putin. It's for pretty much the entire political class in Russia, including Putin's political opposition. This week, of course, there was a ton of attention paid to the death of Alexei Navalny. I think a lot of people ended up being surprised to learn that at least in his past, if not his present, he had a kind of political ideology that to the Western and American ear sounds very, I guess you could say fascist, very kind of shocking statements about how he views Muslims and other non-white people in Russia of being subhuman, the need to exterminate them. Some of these ads that he did, there were people in 2019, 2020, 2021 describing Navalny as kind of more extremist or more nationalist or more to what we would, if you want to impose the left or right framework on Russia, more to the right, the far right, certainly than Putin is. And I think a lot of Americans want to believe that there's this Russian opposition that's just very liberal, very pro-Western, very similar to libertarian, rising up against Putin. What do you make, as best you can, of the nature of Russia's internal politics, the extent and nature of whatever opposition there is to Putin's rule?
Yeah, that's a great question. The simple answer is that what we would call liberalism, let's say pro-Western, pro-democratic forces in Russia have simply been decimated. And a large reason for that is the legacy of the 1990s. The liberal parties of Russia basically were the parties that led the path towards the post-Soviet transition, were in power under Yeltsin, led the transition to capitalism, the transition to democracy. And the policies of the 1990s were absolutely disastrous for ordinary Russian people. I mean, it's just undeniable. And as a result, the liberal parties of Russia have just lost. I mean, they've just lost power. They're just not popular. I mean, they really, the devastation of the 1990s really undermined the liberal movement and liberal parties of Russia. And they were never that popular to begin with. But
if I could just interrupt, if I could just interrupt there, because it's not intuitively obvious why that would be true. There was, I guess, the narrative is that what ended up happening was with the United States and Yeltsin, there was kind of this austerity and this neoliberalism imposed on Russia. There was a lot of corrupt privatization that made a ton of people very, very rich at the expense of pretty much everybody else. Why would those events cause a decline in popularity for the liberal parties, which oftentimes benefit when people are angry about austerity and neoliberalism and the like?
Well, they were the parties that were carrying out these exact policies. So when I say liberal parties, I mean these were the parties carrying out the privatization, very rapid privatization, and these were the parties sponsoring the loan for shares and basically the theft of state property. All at the same time, ordinary people didn't have savings because the Soviet economy was basically a non-money economy. And people lost their pensions. They had there were serious hardships. There was almost a generation of people that really had a significantly reduced standard of living. And honestly, it's really under Putin that one of the reasons that Putin became popular is he really led Russia out of this era and sort of re-established some semblance of a more normal standard of living. In the context of Russian politics, the reality is there just isn't a strong liberal opposition. There was Boris Nemtsov before. Again, he was a pretty popular figure, but he was not. It's still fairly marginal. I mean, Putin is extremely popular even right now. Even if they had free and fair elections, there's a very good chance he would win. Now, of course, there's been a very, very heavy hand against other opposition leaders, but Alexei Navalny was even at the height of his popularity, he was relatively popular among urban, mostly younger people, educated people, urban people who were better off. He had very, very little following in Russia's rural areas, which are dominant. Vladimir Putin carries the rural regions of Russia, the less educated population. But even Alexei Navalny, as you started to indicate, he's not really a liberal in the sense that we would understand in the West. And he was an ethno-nationalist. In the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, Alexei Navalny went far more extreme than Vladimir Putin did at the time. At the time, this was one of the first Russian wars where people in the West were outraged that Russia was invading another country. Alexei Navalny at the time, if I remember, actually called for the expulsion of Georgian citizens from the Russian Federation. And Vladimir Putin is, by comparison, much more of a pluralist, and especially at that time. I think he's less so now, but and I don't mean to. I certainly don't want to sound like I'm defending Vladimir Putin, but I think within the context of Russian politics, the liberal parties or the pro-Western parties have done a lot to undermine themselves. I will say, I do want to add, just for the sake of some balance here. I mean, Alexei Navalny, I think he was not the kind of hero that he's made out to be in the West, but I do think the guy had a lot of guts. I mean,
Absolutely.
He really did
Oh, for sure.
stand up.
I mean, he went back to Russia knowing what his fate was likely to be, and there's no taking that away from him.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to.
No, for sure. I just wanted to get it. I think everyone can recognize that, and I think it is impressive. I think when people sacrifice for a cause, independent of what you think of their cause, you have to admire that, just like on a kind of personal level. That level of physical and moral courage, I think, is rare. But I think also it's important to distinguish propaganda from reality. I mean, just in general, that's a good thing to do. Let me ask you one last question. I could ask questions for a lot longer than that, and we would love to have you back on. Obviously, Russia is a very important country, more so than ever to the United States, because of how much focus there is on it, the attempt to blame it. Let me ask you about the last couple of decades of the U.S. or the Russian-Western relationship, the Russian-U.S. relationship. Putin loves to emphasize, and he did so again in this recent interview that he did with Tucker Carlson, that there was part of the history between the U.S. and Russia where he thought that the Russians could actually integrate into the West, almost to the point of even joining NATO. Maybe that wasn't really a serious proposal, kind of just more symbolic. But certainly, if you listen to the statements of U.S. presidents, starting with Clinton, going to Bush, who famously said he looked into the eyes and the soul of Vladimir Putin and think he's a good person. Obama talked a lot about how he didn't want to confront Russia. He thought there were ways that the U.S. and the Russians could work together in places like Syria, where they had common enemies, and facilitating the Iran deal. He certainly didn't want to confront Putin over Ukraine or Syria. He didn't think it was worth it. Obviously, Trump ran on a platform of better relations with Russia. How much of an opportunity was there really that has been just squandered by whichever side you want to assign the most blame to? But how much of an opportunity was there really from the perspective of Putin, the willingness and inclination of Putin to have much more constructive relationships with the United States and the West than Russia ended up having?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's plenty of blame to go around. I think one very important episode that is not well appreciated, understood in the United States is that after September 11th, Russia and the United States had entered a rocky patch in the late 1990s with the NATO bombing of Serbia, which was a Russian ally. And of course, the fact that that bombing was carried out by NATO, which Russia saw as an anti-Russian force, in an offensive military campaign, made Russia very unhappy. But after September 11th, Vladimir Putin, he was the first foreign leader to call George W. Bush, and they had already had a very good relationship. And they, from many accounts, there's a book by Peter Baker that documents a lot of this. They really were like looking toward cooperating in this post 9/11 world because Russia had all these concerns about terrorism in Chechnya, and now the United States was going to be focusing on Afghanistan, and there was a lot in common, a lot of security interests in common. And this was based, Vladimir Putin was talking about the U.S.-Soviet alliance during World War II. That's sort of like what some of the thinking was. And he actually offered George W. Bush, he offered to help him establish U.S. military bases in Central Asia, which was a part of the Soviet Union. I'm talking about post-Soviet Central Asia and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, areas where the United States basically had no relations at all, almost no influence. They'd only been independent for a decade at that point. The U.S. turned him down, actually, and I think the reason for that had a lot to do with Cold War era mindset among the leaders of the American government at that time. The George W. Bush cabinet was made up of a lot of Cold War hawks. They told Vladimir Putin, "We'll establish military bases there. We don't need your cooperation. Like, we don't want you to think that we have to rely on you to do it." This is quite almost explicitly what they said, and really pushed him to the side and made a very forceful effort to sort of establish bases there without Putin's approval or support. This was on top of, at that time, the United States advancing its missile defense program, which meant eliminating the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which the United States basically tore up unilaterally in, I think, at the same year, 2001. And all these other measures that really were very difficult for the Russians to accept. I mean, on top of NATO expansion happening simultaneously. So I can't, I don't know that I can explain why the United States took these positions other than some combination of Cold War era hawkishness among the foreign policy establishment, and also a neoconservative sort of, there was that famous idea of the unipolar moment, that because Russia was kind of down, the United States had this opportunity to remake the entire world and establish itself as the only significant power while it had the opportunity to do so. And I really think the United States bears more of the responsibility for no other reason that it was the more powerful actor and could have made concessions to Russia if in the interest of having a more fruitful partnership. And it just, obviously has not gone in that direction. Stephen Cohen, the famous historian, he's passed away now, but he was saying, even I think as early as 2008, that there was a new Cold War. And I was very prescient. I think that's very clearly the case now. I think nobody would disagree with that.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I think there's no denying that. Well, this has been super interesting. The relationship between the United States and Russia is a very rich history. Obviously, Russian history and its current political dynamic is something that, like I said, I think does take sometimes talking to people who are able to immerse themselves in scholarship, studying it, because the media, just in general, because they're so close to the U.S. government, typically feeds messaging. It's very hard to discern fact from fiction. I think this interview has been super illuminating and helpful in trying to distinguish those two. And I really appreciate your coming on and taking the time to talk to us about it tonight. I think it really helped our understanding of these issues, and we appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Have a great evening.